Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here. Some of you I know were with us on the 18th, the last conference that Graham organised, and so you will have heard some of these comments before, but many of you are new faces to me, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss this subject. Graham invited me to get involved at the beginning of the year. I've been working with Judith Hackett on her ISSG, her Industry Safety Steering Group, and that's been very helpful. And I said to Graham I'd be very pleased to try and make a contribution here, provided Judith is comfortable with that. She said yes, absolutely, so here we are today. We moved at some pace during those early months of the year to gather as much input as we could. I didn't go down the traditional route of forming some fabulous working group with terms of reference. We just got around tables and talked to as many people as we possibly could. I'd like to particularly thank the input that I received from MHCLG, from Cara Kashim-Santa, who I think is here this morning. Cara, where are you? There you are. And your colleague Beth Dunning, who's holding the fort back in MHCLG. And of course to Chandru Disen-Nayaka, and to Lindsay Lewis more recently, who has been a great support as well. So without their massive behind-the-scenes energy, we wouldn't have made the progress that we did as a community, just keeping us pushing along. This morning we are going to have a short panel discussion, some questions and answers, and Malcolm Hind from UKAS sitting here in the front row, and Richard Harrell. Where's Richard? Oh yes, you're here today, sorry, okay. Are going to help us with that, but I must thank them also because their involvement in this was pretty critical. WG0, the Working Group Zero, was tasked with coming up with an overarching competence system, and Graham explained to me that there were over 120 organisations, perhaps more now, Graham, who are involved in certifying, qualifying, training professionals, trades, and other individuals to work in our industry, just in the area of buildings in scope. That's a huge task. I believe now that we have got a paint for the Forth Rail Bridge, which means we don't have to keep on repainting it, but in terms of trying to keep up with that exercise, it's a vast organisation, and we see many of you here today. In my role as Director of Standards at BSI, I'm responsible for the catalogue of British standards that are used across all industry sectors. I come from a construction background. I'm a civil engineer. I've spent a career specialising in risk and disasters, and I'm very keen to try and explore how this sector can learn from other sectors, as the speaker commented a few minutes ago, about dealing with high-risk events. So the task was to come up with a system. And the system that you see on the graphic beside me is intended to illustrate how this will work in future. At the centre of it are the residents, the occupants, the consumers, the members of the public who occupy and use our buildings, the product of our work, along with the industry themselves. And sitting over the top, the role of government, regulators, and a steering committee to try and keep pressure on the industry to improve. But perhaps if I just walk my way round this diagram, and then I'll go into some details to what I'm trying to propose here. We had input from all parts of industry to this concept. What I'm showing you here is a two-pronged approach to the problem of competence. One is the problem described by several speakers just this morning, which is the basic competence to do your job right, to be proud in the quality of the work you do, to recognise the impact your work may have on others adjacent to you, whether it was last week, next week, or in 10 years' time, to have pride in your organisation and that we're there to do a job together, to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. That's a perennial problem in all sectors, but in our industry in particular, when once that skim coat is on, you can't see what's behind it. There is this terrific risk of long-term liability problems, legacy problems that continue forever. So the basic question of are people doing what they're supposed to do on a wet Friday afternoon when they've got challenges in their home life and they want to get out quickly? Are they doing what they are supposed to do? That's the first point. But in the experience of major disasters, you'll quickly come to realize that that's not enough, actually. Everybody can do their job. Everybody can do what they are supposed to do, and the disaster will still happen. It is not enough that people do what they're tasked to do, what it says on the piece of paper. Actually, we're talking about something else altogether. So, whilst it's vital that we carry on persisting to develop the competence of individuals wherever they are working in the profession on whatever projects, the buildings in scope, it is also fundamental that we realise that as a sector, the construction industry, built environment, is not good at understanding the issue of low probability, high consequence events. My colleagues and I, throughout my career, have practically never had this exposed to them. Only in sectors where built environment professionals find themselves in the process sector or nuclear or similar sectors which have suffered major catastrophes before, have they been exposed to these requirements. It's a very different way of thinking. These are competencies that don't even exist in the built environment today, that we have to train in and drive in from the board down, a comment also made a few minutes ago. So what I'm trying to articulate is that there are two types of competence that we need to get right, not just one. The first level of competence, the competences that are all about doing the job you're supposed to do on time in the right way, with pride and with understanding of others around you, is the training and qualification processes that are driven through the many excellent associations, professional institutions on a day-to-day basis. And we need to strengthen that to recognise the additional risks that come on working on buildings in scope, what we used to call higher risk residential buildings, but clearly we're going to extend that in time. But the second is, how are we going to ensure that we educate boards, building owners and senior professionals to realise that they're trying to address a problem that has not been thought of in the built environment, that of low probability, high consequence disasters. And we must distinguish between these two. So the proposal in the system in front of you is that there are three roles, and rather than reinventing new roles, to focus particularly on the roles of principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager, so that the through life risk is accommodated. These three roles will require to demonstrate additional competences in the understanding of the concept of low probability, high consequence events and the behaviours that flow from that. Those special roles could be filled by anybody, any profession. It's not necessary that those people are coming from a fire background or a technical background. In fact, potentially on the contrary, it may be more important that it's a behavioural issue rather than a technical issue. And those individuals, their names will be maintained on a national register held by MHCLG. The vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, of the industry whose names will appear on register of their own associations and other qualification bodies will be there in their own right, performing their work in line with the competence requirements of their associations and organisations. So moving around my diagram, at the top right, the Building Safety Competence Committee is intended to be an interface between industry and government, where we can keep pressure on industry and we can advise the Secretary of State that we're making progress or that we're not. A critical function which is new to some, but not all, of our industry associations is the role of accreditation. Accreditation is often misunderstood, but Malcolm will explain in a few minutes that we're talking about checking the checkers. So many associations, trade bodies, and even the chartered professional institutions have an independent assessment of their schemes that we call accreditation. The Engineering Council performs that function for the professional institutions. UKAS performs that function as the national accreditation body for a number of associations working in this area. But we're requesting now that all organisations that are providing qualification certification of individuals shall themselves need that facet of their training to be accredited by UKAS, Engineering Council, or another body, should another body be able to fulfil that role. What do you accredit against if you don't have a competence framework? So fundamental to this approach is that there shall be an overarching competence framework that defines the basic principles of competence and allows us and the accreditation organisations to compare apples and apples. It's fine for one association to say, we have the best training scheme in the world. We have this card, we have this certificate. And you say, but how do I understand whether that is comparable to this institution over here, which also says it has a card and a scheme? So the idea of a competence framework standard is it's a standard that allows comparisons to be made across individual different professional skills training. And we've seen that and we have delivered that in other areas. In clinical practices, for example, there is a PAS standard which allows the Royal institutions to compare their different schemes in clinical practices. So that's been achieved before. The framework standards will provide guidance and define the requirements for competence in the overarching issues, the behaviours that are needed to help senior people identify low probability, high consequence events. Let me just, we've managed to get into some thing here. Let me just explain a little bit about what I mean. COMA is one of those areas, the Control of Major Accident Hazards Regulations, where this subject has already been tackled. And you will find a lot of very interesting guidance in here for senior leaders. So for senior leaders, I just ask you to interpret, for the time being, the roles of principal designer, principal contractor, and building safety manager. There is much work to be done, and I am looking for volunteers to work with me and MHCLG to try and take this to the next step. We are precisely at the moment where what you see in front of you is a system. The nuts and bolts are yet to be defined. But let me just describe for a minute some of the competencies that are required for COMA in the area of senior leaders. Specific major hazard training has been provided to senior leadership team board members, including non-executive directors. Senior leaders do not rely on contractors' own systems and procedures, but have sufficient oversight and verification relating to contractor competence and consider the imported risk from contractors and suppliers. Senior leaders understand the implications of organisational changes on the control of major accident hazards and are involved in determining the risks of significant changes. Senior leaders ask senior site personnel to talk through key reports, analyses, KPIs in person in order to expand, explain and justify. Senior leaders are visibly present in their businesses and at their sites, asking appropriate questions and constantly challenging the organisation to find areas of weakness and opportunities for continual improvement. They ask about major hazard control. They create an atmosphere of open communication. They challenge information received in reports and decisions made by management. They challenge maintenance backlogs, specific audit and investigation findings. Senior leaders receive information on the adequacy of systems and whether they are implemented effectively, not simply their existence. Senior leaders attend and support events such as stakeholder groups, technical seminars and conferences, and provide the resources for those with responsibilities for managing major hazards to attend also. So this concept of low probability, high consequence events and how they are managed is not simply a matter of doing your job. It's a matter of having the skills and competences to interrogate and challenge, even as a non-technical person, people from other walks of life. And this is not familiar to this industry. It's not. So we are going to build that in. We're going to transpose a lot of the learning we already have. We can see this in COMA. And I think you will find that as it morphs into the overarching competences that we're looking for in the built environment, that will provide a very, very good baseline for us to adapt in our sector. That will then provide 2 levels of competence requirement, one to address the overarching top-down behaviours around challenge and responsibility for the duty holders, and one to constantly keep pushing to improve quality from the bottom up. So just in summary then, 4 points here. The Building Safety Competence Committee brings stakeholders together at the top level. The new framework of standards that Graham mentioned at the beginning, which will be set out in British Standards and PAS under responsibility of the National Standards Body. 3 new regulated roles are out there in the consultation. That means that at any point in the life history of a building asset in scope or in occupation, throughout that time period, there is an individual who is responsible for the overarching building safety. The certification of professionals, trades, operatives through their associations, the accreditation function, which is new for many but is going to be vital to have in place, and to ensure that residents form part of that process, not just through the information and transparency that is now open to them, but indeed through helping to shape, through representatives helping to shape those competence standards themselves, characteristic of the national standards body structure. There is a timescale in place. As I said a minute ago, we are at the start of this journey. We have a system designed for you. It's been out to consultation. It appears to have strong support from across the stakeholder community. And now I'm looking for volunteers to shape that into some more detail.